Good morning, everyone. I'm Ingrid Schroeder. I'm the director of the Architectural Association. And for those of you who are not already part of the school, welcome. This today is a kind of a wonderful, I wouldn't say kind of culmination of a body of thinking, but perhaps it marks a chapter. Now, Taranj we had a conversation, goodness, 2 years ago now, on the grass in Venice, about this kind of collision of ideas around the commons and ways of thinking differently. And this, I think, aligned very clearly with a set of agendas that have a deep history within the school, but also have a very, very important future. As you're all aware, every morning we wake up to more implausible news and greater degrees of uncertainty. And one can either get deeply frustrated and depressed, or one can start to think as implausibly, but in a positive manner. And I think that the way in which you start to think differently and start to piece together what might be possible within entirely new contexts is something that the two of you have brought to the AA, and three of you, and Nick, it's so nice to have you back, have brought to the AA in such a productive manner. It follows on from a very strong legacy of action, or of taking action, of not simply examining a context or becoming increasingly frustrated about the context of a community and its inability to act, but to act. And this has been a prevalent theme that we're attempting to consolidate within the school, but with very different voices, because those who want to act don't always agree on how to do it. So I think today is a wonderful opportunity to bring some of these voices together, to perhaps chart a pathway as we move forward, and to share some of the work and ideas that you have been building within the school so far. So great. Thank you so much for being here. I will hand over.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ingrid, and thank you for really giving us the opportunity to also do this, both in the school, and I would say it is very experimental to bring together a community engaged architect, somebody who's in crypto and blockchain technologies, and someone in arts and performance. And in a way, what I'm going to say maybe makes sense within the madness of our trio, why we've kind of created this. But yes, thank you for allowing us to do this and to be in the school. So I want to welcome you all. Thank you for being here. As I already said, we have a diploma unit here, Diploma Unit 2, where Mehrdad, Nick, and myself teach around action, working very collaboratively with local authorities. And that's some of my work and research with London Metropolitan University in the Centre for Applied Research and Empowering Society. So I try to crossbreed in a way across the two for us to make change and impact that's going to actually support both institutions across, so it's good for both. You know, it's good for the students to use the disciplines that are in London Met that we don't have here, and vice versa, the wealth of the students' commitment and the AA's commitment to experimental architectural practice. So, and I just want to say a few things about how it may be, because the commons, again, there isn't a singular definition. There's a lot of definitions of how different people think about the commons. There is the notion of the commons, which is much more as a public good, and James Gilligan, who will talk in the afternoon, has written a fantastic chapter around the difference between public good and common good. And public good is open to us all. It's the crowd. It's for all of us. And common good is much more around series of communities that steward and take care and make decisions together around a particular common resource or whatever that action is. And that then can be federated to be much bigger. But it is about smaller communities coming together towards actually supporting that communal common good. And in a way, I just wanted to also say that a lot of the work that we're also doing is questioning this binary state-private sector, public-private partnership paradigm, which we can all agree hasn't completely worked, right? There's a bottom line with private sector. And so we're beginning to kind of think about what does a commons public partnership look like as community organizations collectivizing, potentially in community development trusts, to then partner with public sector to really kind of push for social and ecological value. But this is quite a precarious space. And actually a lot of people, if you're not in it, it is a very different type of practice when you're in the community sector or sphere. It is informal, its governance is not hierarchical, or at least shouldn't be. It has very different material systems, which might be based on localized circular economies. It's planetary. And in a way, there is a very different types of practice within any discipline and different ways of doing within it that is not the same as the public sector or the private sector. It sits in a space between the household and the state, which is at the moment unthought about, you know, and it has been traditionally the space that has probably been filled by the other, be it women or whatever other is framed. So a lot of what we're also looking at is what is that missing political sphere as a commons, if it can be framed as a commons, or anyway, it's a community sector. And how does that community sector, if we hypothesize that it's a missing political sector, that as Kate Raworth in Donut Economics also talks about, starts to negotiate between the state, the markets, and the communities and civil society. And so it is a very precarious space. It is not a funded space formally. So you can't think about that. That can't be sustainable as volunteering, you know. And that's why we have been thinking. We're bringing this conference in a way to think, well, what is the economic structure? What could be the economic structure for this other sector that is the community sector? That's where people's voices, it's informal, and people's voices are actually not being heard, which is symptomatic of why we're having some of the political issues that we're having, because at the state level, you're not reaching the people on the ground. And I just want to finish, because I think there are much more interesting people talking here, but I just want to finish by saying we have to, having been operating in the liberal left for 25 years, I have come to a point where I think we need to look at impact, and we have to kind of maybe question our own ideologies and start to look at technologies that might ideologically not be a fit to those ideologies, you know, and things like that, or finance or markets, and start to see, okay, let's evaluate the impact that we're making rather than the kind of conflicting ideologies of left and right, which are divisive actually, and are they even relevant anymore? So that's what this is. So I'd like you to have an open mind around all of that, and to really, at the back of the mind, just think what other change we're going to make and the impact. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to hand over to Meredith, who's going to chair the session, and we can hear from our wonderful speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taranj and Ingrid, and thank you for organizing such an interesting event. When I was asked to be the chair for this event, I said I'm probably the least qualified, because give me money and I'll just spend it. And that's partly also, though I joke a little bit about it, but it's partly also because when you come across established structures that require you to deal with money in a particular way, you tend to challenge that. And so you end up being called financially irresponsible sometimes, but perhaps it's a good place for me to be. So without wasting any more time, are they online, are they? We're going to start with our keynote speaker. And hello, Bronwyn. Can you hear me, Bronwyn?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Brilliant. Listen, I'm just going to read three lines from your biography before I sort of pass it over to you. But I noticed in some of your podcasts that you tend to begin by asking the person you're interviewing to present themselves as they see themselves. So bear with me 1 second as I read the beginning of your biography. So Bronwyn Williams is a polymath who will challenge your assumptions about the present and the future. She's a futurist, economist, and business trends analyst. Part economist, part strategist, Bronwyn's particular areas of expertise include fintech trends, alternative economic models, and sustainable futures design. So, Bronwyn, over to you. How would you sort of introduce yourself and see yourself?
I generally refer to myself as a futurist and an economist because I like the slight dichotomy and irony between that mix, which does represent both my professional and my academic background. I'm a practicing futurist now, but I have worked in the economic space and I have a master's degree in that field. And what I always find interesting is that futurists vehemently do not predict the future, whereas economists do. And I like to play within that space, within that space of projecting past trends into the future, and then also exploring beyond that projected line into the possible. So sort of venturing into the fringes of the almost impossible, much like Sherlock Holmes said, if it's not impossible, we can't dismiss it. We just have to eliminate the impossible and then work with everything else that remains. And that's sort of the space that I play in. I am a partner at a little firm called Flux Trends based in Johannesburg, South Africa. That is my perspective on the world. It's probably important for people like you sitting on the other side of the planet in a very different climate at the moment to understand that some of the comments I might make are from a slightly different perspective. And I'm very grateful that you have invited me to this platform to share some of those observations. I'm not going to solve many of the problems that were discussed in the introduction. Rather, my role as a professional generalist now is to give you some context to help you understand the world, what's going on at the moment, and then hopefully give you some clues as to what you can do with your own agency to therefore influence that future and change the parts of the world that we find discomfortable and to run with some of the ideas that we think could be useful for furthering whatever our particular ends and aims are. So hopefully that's a bit of context for today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And we are very honored to have you. And with that, please begin your presentation. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So let's start with context. As I said, I am a generalist, and I think that one of the biggest things that we are looking at the moment, if we want to change the world, we need to understand it and ourselves first. And one of the big things, the themes of the moment, the present reality, is that we do find ourselves within a very stark zero-sum context at the moment. So I'm going to take you through a few trends and signals that sort of illustrate this picture, because we have to understand this context if we want to build anything more constructive upon it. We'll start with the emerging class conflict, which I like to describe as a conflict between the 10% and the 0.10%. This is, in effect, a growing resentment around meritocracy and the idea that if you work hard, you're going to go far in life. This is breaking down because with the present generation, what's happened from an economic perspective is that necessities have become really expensive. And I'll take you through some examples of that a bit later. But luxuries have become cheap. And into that, we can also put the categories of things like luxury values, which is a really interesting idea I'll come back to in a second. But to start off with, most of us are aware, although it took place in the US, which is neither your continent nor mine, there was that assassination of the United Healthcare CEO, which from my vantage point as a trained analyst and a futurist was an important signal and a bellwether of the state that we are in. And why it was important was not so much that a disgruntled assassin decided to use violent ends to make his points around the inequalities and the ineffectiveness of the whole American healthcare system and just how unfair it is to those who are paying and those who are profiting from it. took a violent action. That is perhaps understandable. What is less understandable, or what is more important in terms of current context, is the way the world has reacted to this. And I do say that the world, from my country, South Africa, through to China, through to Europe and the Americas, people across social media have effectively lionized the assassin, turned him into, or at least the alleged assassin, turned him into a fashion figurehead, fetishized and written fan fiction about the accused and arrested gentleman at hand. I'm not going to go into names, so I don't want to be really part of that whole conversation, but this is the reality. And there's a reason for this. There's also a reason that guillotine memes are trending across social media. There is a growing class rage, and this has many roots, which we're going to get into today. But really the point here is that violence, even physical violence against the seemingly ultra wealthy and rich, is becoming something that's almost morally condoned and even egged on by general society, which is a shift. There's a moral line that we seem to be crossing here, but it has many real reasons. Now, there are other sort of more prosaic signals and trends that we can look into to further illustrate this point that I'm trying to make. The one would be, which was actually one of the key points in our State We're In briefing we do every year at my agency in January, and that is the rise of the so-called Parmesan bandit, or an olive oil shoplifter. This is, again, a kind of interclass conflict we're starting to see little signals of all across the world, where we're starting to see people shoplifting luxury grocery purchases. This is not a starving person shoplifting a loaf of bread in order to survive. We're not talking about Les Mis context here. Rather, we're talking about middle classes who, by global standards, are actually fairly well off, starting to think that it is okay to shoplift luxury grocery products like Parmesan cheese or olive oil or expensive little bottles of pesto or jams, for example. And the reason that people are justifying theft in this regard, whether it's through a cashless checkout or whether it's just putting it into your coat, as seen in the picture here, people are saying corporations have too much money and I'm entitled to my little luxuries that I used to be able to afford and now cannot, due to our perception that corporate greed and capitalism is unfair for some of us. So this rise of kind of amorality or socially condoned petty crime also runs up into socially condoned, as I said, quite violent crime, which is, of course, much more serious as we get into that. Similar to that, we have seen recent data that came out that shows that Generation Z across the Weird West, in other words, the Americas and Europe, 1 in 4 of them think that it is okay to indulge in a form of consumer activism that effectively boils down to credit card fraud. Essentially, young people think it's okay to purchase goods online and then return them or pretend that they never were delivered in order to get the credits, or to reverse charges for goods and services that they have indeed consumed, dispute them with the bank, and effectively get those goods for free. And as it says on the slide here, people are justifying this and actually calling it consumer activism. Again, saying crime and fraud is okay as long as it's against a corporation that is wealthier than I am. I deserve to kind of claw some back and get some back from the society around us. We can see similar things with the rise of dupe culture, of course, the fact that people are happy to purchase knockoff products at a cheaper price and therefore kind of claw something back from the big expensive brands and stick it to the noses and faces of the ultra wealthy in our societies. Then we also have, moving away from the sort of amorality and the graying of morality in the face of extreme inequality, we can also see how this trickles through to our places of work and therefore affects the economy from a microeconomic perspective upwards too. And here it's worth pointing out the rise of the so-called minimum effort Mondays or lazy girl jobs phenomena that was really popular and still is on social media last year and continuing into this year. This is the idea that young people with influence, are encouraging each other to find jobs and do as little as possible in exchange for their paycheck. They're encouraging each other to say that corporations will eke all of the life out of your soul, squeeze as much blood as they can get out of you, but you should fight back and in exchange do as little as possible in exchange. You should fight the machine through inaction. And this is quite a mind shift. It's a shift away from participation, and it's a shift and descent again as into what I'm saying today, into this zero-sum thinking. This idea that when I'm buying something from a store, the store is winning and I am losing. I am getting the short end of the stick. It's not a fair exchange of value. Same thing in places of work. It's not a fair exchange of value. The time that I'm giving to this company or corporation doesn't translate into equitable value in terms of what they pay me and what's in my paycheck. There is a sense that for someone to win, someone else has to lose. And that all too often it's the employee or the consumer that's on the losing end of that equation. And therefore it is somehow justified to fight back by extracting as much value from the other side too. This is at a very community and social level what happens with zero-sum thinking. And we can zoom out just a little bit more, again, back to the US of A, which is nicely disconnected from both yourself and myself, but still very much parts of our world, and to their descent into nonsense economics. Of course, this is the land of the white picket fence and the American dream, and this idea, again, of meritocracy. If you work hard, you can get places. This doesn't quite work in reality anymore, where we start to see signs like this popping up in churches, places of worship, and shopping centers across the American Midwest. You can see on the slide here, it shows safe parking or safe space, and it's got that rainbow heart. These are all symbols to people who are sleeping rough or sleeping in their cars, that they can park their cars in this particular parking lot all night long and be able to sleep safely within their vehicles. This is speaking to the sort of underbelly of a growing homelessness crisis. And a lot of people might instinctively jump to a little bit of judgment, saying that people are sleeping out of their cars, they're the edges of society, people who have somehow failed in their lives. But this is simply not true. The kind of people who are being interviewed, who are taking advantage of these safe spaces, are people working full-time, previously quite well-respected jobs and careers. Teachers, nurses, people working in social welfare, for example, that are earning a full-time salary but can't afford a physical fixed address, that are instead being forced to sleep in their vehicles. This is, again, just a bellwether in terms of the seemingly unfairness, the reality of the unfairness of the economy that we find ourselves in. And of course, I've pulled out a few of the more extreme examples, but the purpose is to get you to think about these narratives that young people are seeing and therefore challenging through their behaviors and through how they're seeing the world. And this is not coming from nowhere. Again, even if, as many of us are, very cynical about the idea of trickle-down economics, that the idea of all tides rise, or all boats rise along with the tide, and that if we allow the rich to get richer, some of that money will sort of trickle down to the rest of us. That hasn't exactly played out according to the neoliberal dream that we were sold in the 80s and 90s. But trickle-down values, or luxury values, as some other leaders in the sort of the academic space have been talking about, really have happened. And that's what we're seeing here. This idea of zero-sum amoralistic behavior and thinking is a reflection of the political leaders we have across the world. Trickle-down values are a reality, and we know this with what's happening with geopolitics at the moment, with the descent into populism and nationalism, which is not restricted to any one continent at the moment. It seems to be, we have a global consensus on not having consensus, in other words, when it comes to geopolitics, and this idea that it's okay for Holland or for America to turn off the taps of international aid to focus on local priorities. The idea, again, that my country can only win if your country loses, or if your country is winning, my country is losing. this idea of sort of extreme selfishness and nationalism has come down from the top. So we shouldn't be surprised when 18-year-olds think credit card fraud is okay to get back at a corporation, when this is the same behavior they see emulated through our so-called democratic world and society too. And then, of course, we've got the really interesting Alderman Trust Barometer, which dropped earlier this year. If you haven't read it yet, it's quite interesting. As someone who's followed the Alderman Trust Report, which is, of course, a global study on how trust is affecting people all across the world and how they feel with regards to their society and their state and corporations and NGOs. This year, a new word dropped into the paper, which really does validate a lot of the hypothesis I've been talking you through today. And that is that the trust breakdown they've been tracking for quite a long time, that people are losing trust in their political leaders, in companies, and even in NGOs, has now turned into grievance. And grievance is this idea that, again, I pay more, but I get less. It's a breakdown in the social contract in much more explicit terms. This idea that we pay too much tax and we don't get enough in terms of service delivery. We pay too much in terms of inflation and the prices of goods in shops and stores, but we get less in exchange. We work harder, but we seem to fall behind year by year. And this is no longer just a sense of frustration, it's a sense of grievance. And this also translates into growing percentages of people thinking it is okay that non-democratic and even violent ends or means are used in order to justify the ends that they want. So we can see this in terms of a breakdown in terms of how people respect ideas like democracy. And of course, we see it in terms of how people trust each other, as well as the institutions that are supposed to kind of hold our societies together. And it really is an indictment on all of us that says that unless we get this trust, unless we get the equations of fairness more fair in our societies, when it comes to interactions between employees and employers, or between citizens and states, or between companies and customers, unless that equation becomes fairer, we're in a pretty dire descent into distrust and into a lack of a strength in our societies, which comes from those very basic ideas of first trust and fairness first. You have to believe that the system that you are a part of is fair, that you can win in it if you are going to be a constructive part of that society. So to kind of sum up what I was saying there, if during the COVID times, many of us had a life audit that ended up resulting in things like the Great Resignation or in young people turning to minimum effort Monday jobs, that sense of grievance and non-acceptance of our personal lives is now translating into a sense of grievance and non-acceptance of our social lives, or the way our societies are set up, and the way the people that we have voted that are supposed to look after us are not necessarily looking after us. And here we see social contract audits taking place all across the world, as particularly young people are challenging the fairness of the equations and the economic systems that dominate our lives. And perhaps the most interesting example to sort of pull into there would be the tax revolts that we've seen recently in Kenya, which were run by young people. What's happening in Africa is, of course, we also have this zero-sum sort of thinking descent that's being driven by the great indebtedness of particularly developing world societies, where people are in countries like my own paying back more money in terms of national physical debt than they are spending on development on their own citizens. And in order to fund the debt, governments are turning to their citizens and asking them to pay more tax. And particularly, like in places like Kenya, where you have a young population, governments are expecting young people to pay back money that previous generations benefited from. And in Kenya, the young people said, enough, no more, we're not going to pay that. Now, those tax protests were met with quite violent oppression from the government, but nonetheless, they have been effective in getting the government to reevaluate how that money is going to be paid back and if it can be paid back more fairly. And that's what all these sorts of things that I've been talking about are about. This idea of we have to have more fair systems if we are going to expect people to participate in them. So that's the context. But now let's move on to another layer, which is the actual numbers themselves and the fact that, of course, what we measure gets manipulated, gets managed, and of course, gets funded too. So I want to divert a little bit to talk about the difference between price and value, which all too often we end up conflating, even though they really are not the same. They're certainly not the same in a world where a teacher can work a full-time job and still not be able to pay or afford a house to live in. Clearly, we have a little bit of a challenge when it comes to price and value. And we have to understand this if we hope to build more inclusive, more sustainable, more fair systems going forward. And the first distinction here I want to mention is, of course, the difference between value and invaluable, which is, I think, a really interesting idea that we're going to have to grapple with, particularly if we want to try build more community-based new economic models to build more fair, sustainable communities and cities upon. And here, of course, we can talk about the classic economic difference between diamonds and water. Water is invaluable. There is no price if you are thirsty and do not have water to drink. You will die without water. So water is invaluable, but it's actually quite cheap, even if it is getting more expensive in the developed world. That is true, but it is still very, very cheap. And then you've got, of course, diamonds, which have no real value, but have a huge value in terms of price, even if that value is a bit lower this year, thanks to the advent of synthetic microwavable diamonds that you can now get at a lot cheaper price than the ones dug under the ground. The point is, price here is not actually a good representation of value. And this is something that perhaps we haven't made clear enough to young people who often conflate their personal value or self-worth and value with their market price or the price that the market will pay them a salary of, which is, again, clearly just not true. Not when you look at the difference between a banking CEO's take-home pay and the take-home pay of a teller working in that same bank. Their price differential is certainly not their actual value differential. And these are things that we absolutely have to challenge in any new, more fair economic system. We have to try bring price and value closer together again. And then very similar to that, but just interrogating this from a slightly different angle, the other thing we want to look at is the idea that values do have a price. For the last maybe 20 years, the global world has basically been deluding itself that values do not have a price and that, in fact, values can add to your profitability. But then a friend of mine this week sent me a picture from New York City, where that famous Defiant Girl statue in front of a particular building that houses currently a corporation that once professed to care about values of things like diversity, equity, inclusion, and gender equality, is now no longer committed to those values, although they commissioned that statue. They commissioned that statue during a time when diversity, equity, and inclusion was seen as a profitable strategy. And of course, I follow your UK stock market news quite closely too. I know how even before Trump came into office, a lot of UK-based listed companies were disinvesting in their diversity programs and their sustainability programs, so the whole ESG space, because they weren't translating into bottom line value. Now, I was listening to the introduction to the session, and this topic did come up. It's this idea that if you are only investing in ESG aims, in value-based activities, in equity, in equality, in caring and kindness to your community, because it translates to additional revenue on your bottom line, you have largely missed the point. In fact, in the real world, values have a price. It costs you to turn down the bribe or to not participate in corruption. Certainly in my country, I don't know what it's like in yours. You have to deliberately let go of opportunities in order to stand by your values. Same with the values around diversity, equity, inclusion. If you are only investing in them when it is politically popular and market profitable to do so, then there were never values to begin with. They were only ever marketing, paperwork or window dressing, if you want to put it that way. And the last few months, probably the last 12 months, if you sort of follow the unraveling first of the ESG market, or the E part of the ESG market, in terms of the massive pushback we saw around carbon markets and disinvestment from lots of companies last year, through to this year, we've seen a lot of disinvestment around the S&G side of ESG, social and governance issues. Because of political winds changing or market winds changing, it has been quite a reckoning from the sidelines to see which companies and which countries actually care about these things and actually have values, and which ones were only doing it when it had a material impact. And I think this year is the year that everyone's going to have to decide that for themselves. As consumers, deciding whether to buy cheap, fast fashion or to buy from businesses that reflect your values and support your local communities. Or if you're a business, deciding whether to continue with diversity programs, even though you don't have to because there's no stick on the government side, or you don't want to because there's no carrot on the market side. It's going to reveal who really has values and who understands the difference between value and invaluable, and who understands that values and taking a stand might have a price. Who's prepared to pay that? I think communities are looking at this, and that although in the short term, you might think that making the commercial decision is the correct choice for shareholder value, in the long term, all of your shareholders are people too. And these sorts of pendulum swings have a way of coming back around. And people are not just consumers. They also have a memory of how people were treated in the past. This is exactly what we saw with young people now adopting minimum effort Mondays in the workplace, because they saw the way their parents and older brothers and sisters were treated by corporations during COVID, when they let people go wholesale because it was economically, viable to do so, as opposed to taking the empathetic route. Choices here are going to have consequences for people that aren't very, very clear about what the price of values really is. And just sort of wrap up that sermon, we can tie together the idea of the disconnect between price and value, and of course the values or the price of values, with coming back to David Graeber and his seminal work on bullshit jobs, which is an idea that's really fascinated me, because it really just does hit at the crux of what is wrong with our current version of capitalism that we are existing within. And that is that value and price have become so disconnected. Bullshit jobs are not badly paid jobs, as David writes. Bullshit jobs are quite often overpaid or too well-paid jobs that extract more value from the customer or from the company than they actually contribute. And we know this. We know that FIRE, that's the sort of the finance, real estate, investment sector of the economy, extracts a lot more value from the economy than the essential side of the economy. We know what an essential job is. We all lived through the COVID periods. We know the people that we couldn't live without. We know the sort of jobs we're going to need after an apocalypse, and we know they're not the best paid ones. We understand there's a problem there. We're not going to fix things until we try and bring price and value closer together. We're going to be met with cynicism and resistance from the general population. And then another point that I want to make when it comes to the knot or the paradox of price and value and how we get it so wrong is the current movement to try and price things that were previously unpriced, or our current movement to value the invaluable. And there's two things that we're trying to look at in that regard at the moment. A lot of people are doing a lot of work on this. The one is trying to price the value of the care economy. That is to value women's quote unquote unpaid work in the home. Generally, women do more of the household chores and more of the caring of pets and kids and grandparents and cooking and cleaning and that sort of thing. There's a movement to price that. And there's also a movement to price nature, to price our natural commons. And both of these we should go into with our eyes wide open, that the numbers that we come up with when we try and price these things are likely to undervalue them. Because trying to price the love and care of a mother or a father figure in the home is sure to come short. The material number is sure to come short of the real value of that person and that figure in your life. Likewise, our attempts to price nature, to confine the value nature gives to us, which is life, its very self, to compress it into a GDP fit number that we can plug into our economic equations, is sure to miss some of the value there. So this becomes the sort of catch when we try, and many of the ideas to sort of improve capitalism do center on trying to value the unvalued parts of our economy. But I would contend another way to look at it is actually to say, what parts of our economy that we are currently valuing should we stop pricing? And should we take out of that economic side of the market and put it more into the care side of the market? So they're kind of two arguments here, but I think any sort of ideas to design new economic systems have to consider both what could be priced that is not currently being priced, but also what should not be priced that is currently priced. Where are we artificially pricing parts of our world? And to that end, I've got an example in our de facto social credit scores. And no, I'm not talking about totalitarian government conspiracy theories. I'm talking about the way increasingly we are pricing and trying to put quantifiable prices on each other in our interpersonal lives. And here, of course, we can look at the example of dating applications, which very literally rank and value people according to their social desirability. And that social desirability is becoming a marketized good, almost fungible with our markets, in that you can exchange that social credit or that social value of how attractive or you or your personality is in exchange for material conveniences. There are many op-eds at the moment of young women talking about how they exchange their dateability for all sorts of market goods, including short-term housing, to deal with the fact that they can't afford apartments in Sydney, Australia. So this, for me, is a little bit of a warning light that sort of goes off, that shows that sometimes when we try and price intangible things like love and romance and care in the home, we end up devaluing ourselves and diminishing our self-respect. So any community commons economic system that we design should be focused, in my opinion, on elevating people's self-esteem rather than reducing it to what might end up being a lower than real value number. And again, another sort of example we can look at there is that of Grimes, the mother of at least two of Elon Musk's children, who at one point turned her social credit or her fame into an NFT of her very soul. She sold her soul, very literally, to the highest bidder, giving it a number on the intrinsic essence of who she is, which is, again, for me, something to sort of sit and think and play with in terms of our ideas of what should be marketized and what should not be marketized. And when it comes to the commons, what should be protected in common from the market, as opposed to what could be marketized to grow wealth and prosperity for everyone that is part of that system. So there's, again, two ways to look at these things. And coming back to us pricing nature, one of the things that economists have been working on recently is trying to do exactly that. And they've come up with a figure for the economic value or the GDP value that bats add to the global economy. And they came up with a figure of $53 billion US. Now that sounds good and all, but at the same time, when you price things like this, we can also fall into the temptation of pricing things as a way to excuse them away. So on the one hand, valuing bats and showing that nature can add value to our economies, even to the pure crass capitalist side of our economies, by putting a number on them here, we also almost give a price to harm them, right? And this is the inadvertent things that have happened with things like carbon credit markets. By pricing bats, we've effectively come up with a number that excuses people for continuing their bad behavior. And we see this again very similarly with big tech companies who effectively write off fines for violating people's privacy or for allowing child pornography to proliferate across their platforms. They just pay the fine and write it off as a cost of business. This is the other sort of danger when it comes to marketizing things that shouldn't be marketized, like collective harms and harms to the collective commons. As soon as we put a number on it, someone somewhere sees that as an excuse or a price in order to continue doing whatever they're doing. And in that regard, I've got a great example of what happens when carbon markets were taken a little bit too cynically. They were designed to protect our commons, but instead, they're all too often, as I've said, being used to justify continued harm. Now, in my country, we had a very bad period of load shedding. You're very fortunate if you don't know what load shedding is, but load shedding was effectively rolling blackouts that we have endured for the last 20 years. And as of last year, we were having up to 8 to 12 hours a day of rolling blackouts in order to compensate from our failure to maintain our electricity grid. And one of the solutions that was floated to solve our electricity problem in the short term was to bring in what were called car power ships, which is a strange name for effectively a Turkish boat that effectively burns fossil fuels offshore. So you buy a few of these boats, they burn diesel in your harbors, and they then power your electricity grid when your grid collapses, which was basically what was happening with our electricity grid. So clearly these are not exactly carbon neutral technologies. Clearly they are burning fossil fuels in the middle of the sea at very high rates, and diesel, not even the best sort of fuel to burn. But miraculously, through the power of carbon accounting and the current market price of what a carbon credit was, these car power ships were deemed by our government to be, on paper, carbon neutral, because the Turkish company that was delivering the boats promised to purchase an already existing game farm, which kind of shows the cynicism of what happens when we try and reduce real harms to nature and the environment down to kind of tradable, commoditizable goods. So that's just a little story to think about as to trying to avoid some of the cynicism that can come on designing new systems. And to kind of sum that up, we can kind of see that there are things that should be on ledger and there are things that should be off ledger. There's things about us that can be quantified, the price that we charge for a project, but our actual essence, our actual soul, should that be something that we can price and sell? I'm not so sure. Maybe you have different opinions. Maybe you're excited to go and try put an NFT of your soul out like Grimes to see what of your immortal future you can mortgage for today. But let's leave that there in terms of economic context and in terms of global context. And let's move on to a few ideas that we've been tracking around the potential for better games to break us out of zero-sum thinking, the idea that one person has to lose in order for someone else to win, and to move on how we can get into more win-win ways of working together. And here's, of course, the grand irony. According to many philosophers and politicians and economists, capitalism, ironically, is one of the only ways to get a free lunch. And by a free lunch, we mean, in this regard, the sorts of trades where both of us walk away better off than we started out. Not like the Parmesan bandit who walked into a store and felt like they were being ripped off and therefore decided to steal the product rather than pay the market price. That was a trade that didn't feel fair, but rather a trade, say a community fair, where I purchase a hand-knitted blanket from a lady and she gets my money and both of us feel like we benefited from that transaction. These are the sorts of games and economies we want to design where everyone walks away feeling like the whole or the interaction was better than the sum of the parts. This is a way for us to work together instead of seeing each other as adversaries when it comes to any transaction or any commitment to our society or to our economy. And one of the first things we have to do here, and again, I talk as a South African with our dirty, dirty history of apartheid and disenfranchisement of the majority of our population. The question we're still grappling with at the moment is this idea that no economy can flourish when people that are part of that economy don't own that economy. Ownership is one of the first productive things we have to get right. And ownership isn't just, again, talking about a commercial transaction. Ownership goes deeper than that. When you own something, as opposed to being a tenant of that thing or that place or that point in time or that company, when you own something, you become a steward. Not only do you have the right to the benefits of whatever it is that you own, you also have a responsibility to that that you own. Now, some of you might be privileged enough to own your own property. You know this. By owning a property, you are responsible to getting the plumbing right, to patching the roof. But you also have the privilege that comes along with that property, your capital appreciation, your secure shelter from the weather and the elements. But owning that property goes deeper than that, to continue with that metaphor. If you own that property, not only are you responsible to that property, you also have an incentive to look after the community and the land and the economy around that property that you own. Because how your neighbor paints his fence or looks after his verge has an impact on your property value, and vice versa. And if there are homeless people and poor people living in your community, that has an impact on the security, safety, and again, property value of your property. And this is where we can move from zero-sum thinking. Protecting myself, looking after only myself is not going to actually be in the best interests of myself. If I'm an owner of anything, whether it is a property or a share in a company that is part of a country's economy, or whether it's as an employee, shareholding within the company that you work in, you are no longer someone that is not responsible or that thing you own. You are responsible for it, and you become responsible and positively incentivized to look after the whole ecosystem, both physical and financial, around all those things that you own. I mean, you can even relate this to owning a pet. You are responsible to that pet, but you're also responsible and have an incentive around the community bylaws, around how fast cars drive around your neighborhood, for example. So ownership is definitely, for me, a linchpin in terms of building more fair societies. Again, coming back to South Africa, we have a lot of people that don't own our stock market. We have 60 plus million people that live in our country, but less than 500,000 people are invested in the stock market. The example you can see on the screen there is a company that pioneered fractional share ownership that allowed people, even with very small incomes, to start investing directly in listed companies and in expensive property developments around their society, therefore giving them a stake in our South African economy. So when the economy goes up, these people are part now, as co-owners of that economy, part of that success. Whereas before, you're not incentivized to grow your economy if you don't own any piece of that economy. And of course, there's so many examples we can look at there, but this idea of ownership, owning a stake of the place, companies, the land, the property of the place that you live in, is critical for building more equitable societies going forward. And again, in the South African context, this is why, I know Donald Trump's commented on it recently, the bills that we have around expropriation are so close to the heart of so many people in my country, because so many people don't have access to own land, to own the actual country they live in. And of course, when you are literally squatting on property, when you are living in informal housing because you cannot own the title deed of the property that you live on, of course, you're not incentivized to look after that property. And you can look at societies with lower ownership rates and see how much higher crime and littering and just general not looking after your society is. Because why should you look after something that makes someone else wealthier, that doesn't actually enrich your own life, that actually has the opposite effect? So ownership, getting skin in the game, is probably the first principle we have to look at. Another example there would be to look at what's happening with birthright funds. So birthright funds are a really interesting idea that we're seeing popping up in more and more places. They're, of course, common to citizens of places like Alaska or Norway, who essentially have birthright funds in, okay, somewhat ironically, those countries' oil endowments. But there are other ways we could have birthright endowment funds. Some countries are talking about setting up crypto birthright endowment funds. I know you've got a crypto person that we'll be talking a bit later. But this idea of shared, indivisible assets, things like clean air birthright funds, or things like creative capital birthright funds, could be set up for communities or for countries. This idea that as that shared resource appreciates in value, everyone gets a share of that going forward, instead of that asset being effectively siphoned off into increasingly, let's be honest, international corporations' hands. So the sense of ownership and the sense of birthright ownership, the fact that you are part of our community means you are part of our prosperity, are, I think, really interesting ideas to play with. The other idea that's worth talking about is, of course, community currencies. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of people that will talk about this today. But a couple of examples that really resonate with me include China's time banks, whereby younger, healthier, fitter people can bank time with their society by spending time with elderly people. By being part of their community, they can bank those hours and claim them back one day when they are elderly or infirm. And a time banking system is in some ways so much more fair and more closely aligned to price and value than a traditional kind of insurance fund, where the richer can obviously get more at the end of the day than poorer people would. It's a way of bringing people together, which I think is really interesting. And other forms of community currencies that we're starting to see that some people might feel more comfortable or confident with than others are what's happening with digital identities and central bank digital currencies, like the pilot program going on in Thailand at the moment, where the government is distributing essentially social welfare grants to certain trial groups, as they've done the elderly. In fact, that was the last one in January. But through these entitlements that people are given, they not spend it anywhere money. Instead, it's money that can only be spent or has been made programmable, as you can do with cryptocurrencies and blockchain-based currencies like central bank digital currencies. They've been made programmable, so they can only be spent in the locale of that recipient. In other words, in a predefined radius. So they have to spend that money within their communities. And this is an interesting idea, as is ideas of charging foreigners more tax, for example, on property, if they want to own land in a country or in a community that they're not actually physically invested in. So people that are effectively buying properties as landlords rather than buying them as residents could be treated differently by communities without being discriminatory or without being nationalistic. It's rather a case of, if you are part of this community, part of its value, you should have some sort of benefits from that, compared to people who are coming purely to extract capital from that collective good that the physical inhabitants have built up. So those are some ideas of how community currency is going from abstract idea into a slightly more hardened identity that are worth thinking about. But we can also move on to the other concept that I think is quite critical moving forward, and that is to shift our relationships, particularly with our communities and with people that we should be caring about, from purely transactional to transformative. So I come back to the minimum effort Mondays and young people not participating fully in the workplace and trying to do as little as possible in exchange for their paycheck. Quite a lot of the reason for that is because the company-employee relationship has been reduced to the price of the salary. The intrinsic, transformative parts of our interpersonal relationships have been stripped away. So the value you get from having a mentor or having someone that cares about your career and cares for you is not there. Of course, that relationship becomes more transactional and more brittle. So the question is, whether it's a company-employee relationship or a city-citizen relationship or a nation-state-voter relationship, how do we shift from being purely transactional, what can you do for me, what can I do for you, to being transformative, which is what can we do together, which is a very different question. And here to kind of simplify what I'm talking about, I think Albert Hirschman and his exit voice and loyalty kind of said it best. The trick is to try and get more of us into the active, constructive quadrant and away from the destructive, passive quadrant. How do we get more people actively involved in building their communities and their cities and their nations, and less people passively free riding, getting away with doing as little as possible? And also less people actively destroying the societies they're in through amorality, through petty theft, through crime, through zero-sum thinking that pits people against each other. How do we have more voice and less neglect and sort of blinder sorts of loyalty and accelerationism? And these ideas were echoed through research that I did in my part of the world. It shows that young people globally across the world, in fact, largely fall into three categories, very similar to the categories we saw here. Apathy, checking out, doing as little as possible. Anarchy, committing crimes, protests without a cause, that sort of thing. And the more positive one, which is, of course, activism or using their voice to be stewards and citizens as opposed to being consumers and tenants of the societies that they live in. And essentially the question we're looking at is, do we want to be part of seeing things fall apart, or do we want to be part of seeing things get rebuilt in a way that works more fairly for more people? And to kind of end off with, we've got a few interesting people who are doing amazing things in exactly that, shifting from the notion of being a consumer to being a citizen, to having a stake in the society that they are part of. You've got Daniel Gottlieb from New York City, who's organized the Maximum New York City cleanup movement. Those green trash bags behind him, those are bags he picked up himself. He started a community walking group that gets together in soulless New York City to do exactly that, clean up the city that they live in. Not getting paid to do it, just because we want to live in a better place. If our neighborhood is cleaner and nicer, it's better for all of us. And you got Audrey Tang from Taiwan, and the more technical side of getting citizen stewards and more active citizenship in the governing of societies with her vTaiwan and ePolis systems that are available to all governments in an open source basis to allow people to vote and find consensus on tricky policy issues. The famous case study there was how they developed their e-hailing policy by listening to diverse opinions, finding areas of commonality, and then bridging gaps where there was conflict, using technology to aid conversation and consensus rather than to fuel division and reality tunnels. Then there's Songezo Zibi, who actually stood for our elections last year in South Africa, who was not political before, but figured out if no political party on the table was actually reflecting his values, he had to step up and do it himself. And he's built this movement called the Rivonia House Movement that's all about that, active citizenship across South Africa. And in your part of the world, there's John Alexander and his Citizens book, which is rapidly turning into a massive movement. But if you're not familiar with, I would certainly be looking into, where he talks about this idea of stewardship and citizenship and stop seeing ourselves as clients of our states and of our cities and of our governments and start seeing ourselves as active participants in what we do going forward. Of course, under those provisos, there has to be skin in the game and there has to be ownership to shift to that stewardship mindset. And I'm going to end this here. I hope that that sets some sort of context for your conversation today and provoked some sorts of thoughts.